Why Bitcoin Cash? What is Bitcoin Cash good for? Well, just like Bitcoin, with a small adjustment, Bitcoin Cash makes it the digital equivalent of cash. Bitcoin Cash is a fast, secure, worldwide, peer-to-peer electronic cash system with low processing fees. Bitcoin was just the first step. Bitcoin Cash is the next. Bitcoin Cash believes peer-to-peer electronic cash is a useful tool towards economic freedom. So check out Bitcoin Cash at whybitcoincash.com.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Jiu-Jitsu Motivation Podcast. I'm Greg Melita, black belt second degree, owner of Hampton's Jiu-Jitsu.
And I am Brian DeLuca, black belt first degree and author of Jiu-Jitsu for Small People and other weird shit I think about.
Yeah, congrats on that first degree, Brian. Awesome.
Thank you.
Guys, really awesome guest today. A guy that I've been following for a lot of years, even in the fitness industry and the CrossFit world too. When I was back in there, back in the day, Robb Wolf. Really appreciate you coming on, man.
Huge honor to be here. I will bring down property values anywhere people are foolish enough to let me in. So thank you.
So yeah, just want to give you a quick shout out, man. LMNT, love the product. That's part of why I wanted to bring you on here too. Is even just in general in the jiu-jitsu community, not enough gets said about in general nutrition. You know, just for recovery, all of that. But even beyond that, people that get deep into nutrition have no idea the needs of recovery via electrolytes.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny, you know, how many people have, you know, been incapacitated from like a toe cramp while rolling, and that is actually a sign that they were so far down the hole, the pit of electrolyte insufficiency that you know, like once you start cramping, you have been for maybe hours, like loss of fine motor skill, loss of as good of critical thinking, you know, kind of brain fog, lethargy, fatigue. Like once you start cramping, it's the wheels have fallen off the wagon, and there's all this other performance stuff that is being damaged ahead of that, you know. And you think about like drilling and skill acquisition and all this type of stuff is all suboptimal when electrolytes are inadequate and we're not functioning properly. And I could almost make the case that and you alluded to this before we started recording, like all of our energy is produced by sodium potassium pumps. Like that is like the fundamental currency of life. And so you could maybe make the case that if you're unwilling to address like good diet, that you should at least pay attention to your electrolytes. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I just even, you know, recently have not really realized the importance. And obviously the more years you are, whether it's, you know, general fitness, CrossFit, Jiu-Jitsu, I mean, the years add up into your body. And then how many years you're not paying attention to your electrolyte intake, it's pretty surprising. I just didn't realize in general, people, I think in society have this negative view of just salt in general, like, oh, you know, you just want be careful. But I mean, if you're anyway active, and especially if you're following specific dietary guidelines, whether it be, you know, paleo, you know, whatever anybody's following, you actually need more electrolytes than you think. And,
yeah, it's funny because most folks get the bulk of their sodium from processed foods. So if you shift to eating a less processed diet, it doesn't matter whether it's high carb or low carb, you're almost guaranteed to dramatically reduce your sodium intake. And it gets out in the weeds a little bit physiologically, but it's arguable that it's much more important to make sure that your sodium is adequate, because your kidneys are able to kind of sort out saving potassium, saving magnesium, so long as sodium is adequate. But if sodium is insufficient, the body will then start dumping potassium and magnesium in this horrible downward spiral to try to normalize the relative ratios of sodium and potassium. And this is where people can end up hospitalized or potentially dead. This is, you know, when folks are just like, they've got the gallon of water and they're drinking on it, you know, and you really see this with triathlon in particular, but some of these obstacle course races, multi-hour obstacle course races where folks are only using water, or they're using a hydration product that just doesn't have enough sodium. And I mean, like, I would argue that Pickle Juice would be a far better option for the vast majority of people than like 99% of the hydration options, or just going super old school and doing like a salt tablet and chewing on that and then sipping on water as per thirst would be a better strategy for most people to avoid that hyponatremia, the low sodium environment, which literally could be life threatening. Yeah.
That's the thing. Like, when you're drinking and you're an athlete and you're convinced by what you research that you need, gallon of water a day or whatever, you're actually flushing out, like you said, you're flushing out what you actually need.
Possibly making it worse. Yeah. Which is, absolutely insane. For years, just a lot of water. And then, a Gatorade, which is, that's actually is going to slow down the process of getting electrolytes in your body because there's sugar in there, and LMNT has like a specific ratio, right? Yeah. Well, so we have a gram of sodium. Actually, I've got a box here. So this may end up being backwards, but like we have 1,000 milligrams sodium, gram of sodium, 200 of potassium, 60 of magnesium. When Gatorade first came out, it used to have a gram of sodium per serving. And over time, the sugar has gone up and the sodium has gone down. Yeah. So when it first came out, Gatorade was really pretty awesome, particularly for its time, because it actually had adequate sodium. But over time, we've gotten more scared of sodium and kind of more accepting of sugar, ironically, and probably not to our benefit. That's for sure.
I think Gatorade also sort of became like a kid's drink. Let's be honest.
It really did.
I'm not trying to bash Gatorade, because I'm with you. When it first came out, it was like groundbreaking, right? And now it's like what you put in your kid's lunch because you don't want to give them a juice box,
Right. Right.
Yeah. So actually, I mean, I just love the product. And like I said, I got it even before I knew it was you, and having been following you for years. Just really cool to see that, and the awareness of that just being way more. But I think, the Jiu-Jitsu community should be embracing this a lot more. I don't think you see enough of that. You see a lot of nutrition, but you don't see specifically recovery and just adequate levels of electrolytes being pushed in the Jiu-Jitsu community. And, going back in history a little bit, I didn't even know, my friend, that you did jujitsu until recently. How insane is that? So we just figured we needed to have you on, because I just knew you as the nutrition guy when I did CrossFit back in the day and in the fitness industry. I had no idea you trained, and I'm like, oh man, we got to get this guy on. So go talk a little bit about your personal jujitsu journey, how that interlinked, how'd that start?
Oh man, it's it's kind of a cool story in a way. I was living in Long Beach, California back in the early 90s, around 92 through 94. And I was doing Thai boxing. I had gone down there to do some JKD because I was just, young guy interested in Bruce Lee. I went to the Inosanto Academy, was doing some Kali, Eskrima, some of the Thai boxing, a little bit of the what's the French kickboxing deal?
Silat? Silat, right?
No.
That's
Savat.
Yeah,
something with an S. Yeah, that's all I know.
So I was doing all that type of stuff and really enjoying it. And then I had heard about like the Gracie challenge, where there was like $100,000 for, if you could beat these guys in unarmed combat and everything. And it was kind of interesting. And there was all kinds of, discussion around it. And then the UFC happened. And it was literally around that time that this guy, Carlos, came to the gym that we were at. And he was a purple belt under the Gracies at the time. He was from Brazil. And he was just kind of showing us his wares. And I had never felt more helpless in my life. Like I had a couple of years of wrestling in grade school and high school, nothing to write home about, but just enough so that I was really good at like building base and turning in. And when you build base as a wrestler, like there's necks and arms and stuff galore for somebody who knows jujitsu to harvest, but I had just never I had never felt as helpless in a situation as I had been. And he was about my size. There were definitely, I was never a great Thai boxer, but I was okay. And you could at least like ball up and have some sort of defense there. But the interesting thing was that the harder I tried to go against this guy, the worse my situation became.
Yeah.
And that was obvious, like right from the beginning. And the best analogy I've had to this is like a wood chipper. Like if you've got a big bushy branch with kind of spidery leaves and stuff at the end, if you've got a really good wood chipper, you can kind of stick that in it and still get it back. But if you really jam the whole thing in there, it takes the whole fucking thing and it's gone. And that's the way it felt with this guy. If I went really hard, it was worse than if I like sat back and relaxed, and I was like, how does this work? So that was 1993, 1994. Wow. And I had a choice at that point. I had an opportunity. I went and did a little bit of training like at the school in Torrance. And I was also doing a little bit of judo with this guy, John Ogden, who was like this judo, like demigod within Olympic judo circles. But I was really close to getting my Thai boxing certification as a coach. And I focused on that, which I'm glad in some ways that I did, and kind of horrified that I did that, because I didn't really get to do jujitsu again until like 2004, because there just wasn't much around. I moved out of Los Angeles, went up to Chico, California, eventually went up to Seattle, and there was a little bit of jujitsu here and there, but it was always like nobody at that point really owned their own schools. It was always a Brazilian guy who was renting space from a karate school, and it was at like 9:30 at night on alternating Tuesdays, and I could just never pull this stuff off. But in 2004, I was actually introduced to John Frankel, who is I think I forget what degree black belt he is now, but he's had his black belt for like 22 years now, and he was introduced to me by Greg Glassman, the founder of CrossFit. And so John wanted to open an MMA and Jiu-Jitsu school, and I was looking at moving out of Seattle and opening a CrossFit facility. So he introduced John and I got to train with John a little bit at that time, but I was running the CrossFit school, and I was also kind of the head coach of a capoeira group. And so I was, again, just like this time crunch, and couldn't really do all that much. And so then we have to skip forward to 2012 was when I started actually in a concerted fashion doing jujitsu, and have been pretty consistent over the intervening 10 years now. And I got my brown belt October of last year, or the previous, October of last year. Yeah.
You've done like dude, that's like 10 martial arts you've listed. That's like pretty crazy. That's pretty well rounded, man.
Yeah. It's been a lot of fun. And I mean, I was never the guy that, one thing I learned is that I like doing this stuff because I just like movement and I like learning. There are people who really like fighting, and like they can turn a switch that I have to be like getting mugged, or my kids getting, attacked or something to turn that switch. And so I think that this is why I was okay at Thai boxing, but not great. Like there were people that were just like killers.
Yeah.
I was never that person. So, I love doing this stuff, but it's definitely, jujitsu in particular is just where I get my community. Like we moved to this Kalispell area of Montana because the Straight Blast Gym organization that we're a part of, there's 3 phenomenal schools within a 30-minute drive here. There's like 600 members within this Flathead Valley area that we're able to hang out with, and our kids get to know. And so when we were thinking about relocating out of first Reno and then Texas, like that, the having a good jiu-jitsu community was like the deciding factor in where we decided to move.
Right.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and I had discovered you, like I was saying years ago, we were chatting before we started. We frequented a lot of competitions in Santa Cruz. Specifically, there was the U.S. Open, and I competed there in the U.S. Open. It's blue belt, it's purple belt. And I remember in 2007 in Santa Cruz, which I love that town, everybody at the tournament at the U.S. Open for Jiu-Jitsu was wearing CrossFit shirts.
Right.
2007, let alone did I realize that Santa Cruz was the birthplace of CrossFit.
Right.
Via Greg Glassman. And then I go home, I'm like, what the hell is this CrossFit thing? I look up, and then what's the first thing that pops up is what is fitness, amazing little piece, kind of like a white paper of if you will. So awesome. And once again, this is really before CrossFit really hits it big, because this is 2007. And I get into the whole thing. I was working at a Gold's Gym and around 2007, and I had gotten my brown belt, and then I got into the whole CrossFit thing. I was doing main site WODs, and then had with a buddy of mine at the gym, he gets into CrossFit. We wind up getting level 1, and then just getting into the whole thing. But then I kind of, overtrained, and this ties into electrolytes really, deeply, because when I started doing CrossFit and even like coaching at a box, and I'm training jujitsu like all the time, I overtrained way too easy, because looking back now, I should have just done whatever workout like we focused on, whether it's a strength portion or, Olympic lift, and, left the WODs alone and just had jujitsu as my WOD, if you will.
Right.
Because imagine just doing strength stuff, Olympic lifts, and then doing a WOD and then going to train. I mean, jujitsu, you're going to just, kill yourself. Yeah, so I wish not only should I have smartly done it a little bit better as far as my own training. I felt strong as hell, don't get me wrong, but I just was getting injured and overtrained. But on top of that, if I had any of the recovery and electrolyte knowledge from you, I would have been way better off.
Well, I was not savvy to it back then either. And I have to give a little hat tip to Greg Glassman. I had mentioned this before we started recording, but it was maybe 2003 or 2004. I was in Santa Cruz chatting with him, and we were talking about diet and everything. And somehow the topic of sodium came up, but he was just making the point that when people shift to a minimally processed whole food diet, which, he was a big fan of the Zone, and it's very similar to the paleo shtick that I'm kind of a fan of. But regardless, if you just shift to eating minimally processed foods, you tend to dramatically reduce your sodium intake. And he made the case that when people shifted that way, they improved their diet. Oftentimes they notice feeling awful until they got a minimum of 5 grams of sodium a day. And 5 grams of sodium is actually like 10 grams of table salt, like very close. And so it's an enormous amount. And, Greg was savvy to that need. And I remember that conversation. I took it in at the moment, but the thing that I didn't do was go home and weigh and measure how much sodium I was actually consuming. I assumed that I was getting enough, and I was getting less than half of what I needed.
1,000 grams as like, oh my God, that's too much salt.
Yeah. And that's one of the funny things is that, like, even the American Council of Sports Medicine, ACSM, they recognize that hard training athletes, heat, humidity, which I mean, jujitsu, whether you're wearing a gi or not a gi, like it's always hot, it's always humid. They recognize that 7 to 10 grams of sodium per day is normal for these hard training athletes. But then at the same time, the medical community will emphatically say that you should get less than 2,000 milligrams, 2 grams of sodium per day. So your output may be as high as 10 grams. The recommended input is 2 grams. Like if we're talking about dollars or something, like, it's still negative. You're still bankrupt in that scene. So it's because of the information around sodium and the culture around it and whatnot, it's really hard for people to get it right. And it really should be one of these like super easy things to address. And it is remarkably critical that folks get it right. And even though I'm hawking salt these days, like the way that we recommend that folks get the bulk of their salt, we want to see it come from food. So like 10 olives is a gram of sodium, 1,000 milligrams. A big pickle is 1,000 milligrams. Salami, if you have 2 ounces of salami, it's usually about 1 gram of sodium. So there's lots of great dietary sources that also provide some potassium and some magnesium and some other cofactors. So we really encourage people to get as much of the sodium as they can from dietary sources. But you have to pay attention to it. You're eating some things that are understood to be pretty high sodium foods.
Right. So when I'm dieting and eating super clean, right, I always start craving salt at night, like towards the end of the day. Is there like a good time where you should be intaking that sodium? Is it throughout the day? Is it where your body feels it needs it?
Ideally throughout the day, but it's interesting on that nighttime piece, when we get adequate sodium, or the flip side, if we have inadequate sodium when we're heading into the evening, we will tend to see elevated heart rate, elevated cortisol levels, elevated epinephrine. So we're in kind of a fight or flight mode if we don't have adequate sodium. And so we want to make sure that we do get adequate sodium in the evening in particular, because we find that people will sleep better. We've seen folks that really are geeked out on tracking heart rate variability, the HRV, that their HRV will dramatically improve when they shift into consistently getting adequate sodium. And that could be as simple as like you get a tiny little scant bit of water, like an ounce of water, and then do a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon and swirl it up in there, shoot it down, and people will notice that they do dramatically better with that. Yeah.
That's interesting, because that's where I always find myself craving it. Always, like late at night, I'm like, I need sodium.
Yeah, even I think people don't realize, like, the electrolyte replenishment, to support their physical activity, but and recovery. But isn't that, like, even in general, sodium not only play a big role into your cells and life in general, but your digestion? People don't realize, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, everything, like literally every cellular process, the energy to provide for that is driven by sodium potassium pumps. ATP production is driven by sodium potassium pumps, absorbing amino acids, sugars, not lipids so much, but like all of that stuff is driven by sodium potassium gradients, and moving a sodium ion from here to there so that you can carry something with it. Most of life occurs due to the shuffling of electrolytes. And I was thinking about this, and the two most tightly regulated physiological processes are pH and electrolytes. Like I would argue, I can't think of something more tightly regulated. Like, your body doesn't want pH to go up too much or down too much. If it does, you will get sick or die. And on the electrolyte side, the same thing will happen. The interesting thing about electrolytes, though, is we could be chronically sodium deficient, for example, and you won't see that on a blood test. You will feel it transiently, but what the body will do is pull sodium out of the bones. But when it pulls sodium out of the bones, it also pulls calcium. And so it's thought that this may be one of the big drivers of like osteoporosis, osteopenia. And so it acutely, like if you're running a marathon or doing a triathlon and you're sweating a bunch, losing a lot of sodium, and you're drinking plain water, that's a way that you could get electrolytes out of whack sufficiently to get sick or die. But if you train hard but don't address electrolytes properly, what will happen is you'll feel like shit for a while. Then you'll feel a little bit better because your body has pulled sodium out of your bones. And also it will upregulate things like stress hormones to help you to retain sodium better. So cortisol goes up, epinephrine goes up, basically adrenaline. So there are compensatory mechanisms, but if your body really wants to be kind of happy and functioning with as little stress as possible, it really behooves us to just the same as adequate nutrition. Like if you want to weight cut, you don't want to do a 50% reduction in calories. You want to do like 10% and stretch that out over several weeks so that it's a mild stress, not a crushing stress. And the same thing kind of happens with electrolytes. Ideally, we're on point with electrolytes more often than not, because every little bit of stress that we get is additive, that total allostatic load. And so if this is one of these things that you could really easily take off the stress table, just get adequate electrolytes, then you have some more stress ability to put out there, whether it's training or going to school or dealing with your kids or, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I feel like even just thinking of myself when I was, heavily either dieting or cleaning up the diet, like that's like, I think when people get exposed with this electrolyte loss, when they don't even realize it, like even when I'm eating clean and I'm adding, let's say, salt to every meal or adding a little bit of salt in a pinch in a gallon of water, I am still going to be negative and deficient.
Yeah.
but my training is up high. So I think people, they really have to know, like, people are so afraid of going high on sodium and electrolytes, yet if you're drinking enough water, your body's going to regulate and flush it out via the kidneys, right?
Right. Yeah. And if you overshoot on sodium, the kidneys will generally sort that out pretty quickly. There are sodium sensitive hyperresponders, people that when they overconsume sodium, their blood pressure will go up really significantly. But the interesting thing is those folks don't really see their blood pressure go down that much on a low sodium diet. And the likely reason for that is that these people are hyperinsulinemic. They have chronically elevated insulin levels. And when insulin is high, then we tend to release this hormone aldosterone, and aldosterone causes us to retain sodium. So this is kind of one of the interesting side effects of a lower carb diet is people tend to see their blood pressure decrease. They may pee a lot for the first, couple of days, first week. Is because their body is normalizing as they get their insulin levels better addressed. So there have been a lot of good randomized controlled trials where they put people with hypertension on low sodium diets, and folks don't really see their blood pressure improve all that much. And it's because sodium, again, what the body will do, they put folks on a no sodium diet. But what the body does is it pulls sodium out of the bones, and then it retains it, and so it's not as big a deal about how much you take in at that point. It's how much you're retaining, and so the body is still in this kind of disordered state of having too much insulin. The flip side of this is that people on low carb diets, which I've eaten that way for a long time, and I tend to feel good on it, your need for sodium dramatically increases on that. So, for like a combat athlete, I think it's hard to fuel something like jujitsu with a low carb diet, although people forget that the low carb diet that like a desk jockey programmer needs may be different than like a jujitsu player. Like somebody doing jujitsu several hours a day and eating 200 grams of carbs, that's still low carb compared to what most people eat under that context, but it's very high carb compared to the computer programmer. But you have two totally different work outputs there. But the lower carb person generally will need more sodium across the board.
Well, and I think that's why we see so many of these medical things saying like you need very little sodium, or because they're basing it on the average person who's not getting enough exercise, who's not burning enough calories throughout the day.
Right. And they're just chronically overeating. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And even if somebody is knowledgeable of recovery, replenishment, electrolytes, and they're on a specific, low carb or whatever they're following, and they do get enough of, let's say they just put like a sea salt in their food, and they're getting enough as far as the levels, aren't they still missing? Like, because Element has the 3 parts to it. It's got the potassium too. There's other electrolytes than just sodium and salt that play a big role.
They do. I'll be honest though, like if somebody held a gun to my head and they said, do you need the potassium and the magnesium in there to get, say like 95% of the efficacy of what the product is? The honest answer is no. But nobody in their right mind would have bought something with only sodium in it. So the potassium and magnesium, they are important. People are typically deficient in them. I do think that they play an important role, but, it's really the sodium. Like the sodium is the big piece to that, Again, it's interesting. And I had not studied electrolyte metabolism in 20 years when we got ready when we decided that we were going to head down this road. And so like I grabbed a textbook of medical physiology and started reading on kind of, renal physiology and electrolytes and, what is dehydration versus proper hydration and all these sorts of things, some review papers on electrolyte metabolism. And what was fascinating is that the sodium is just this linchpin. Like if you are on point with sodium, the body is really good at kind of sorting everything else out. And yes, we should eat more whole foods. Yes, we benefit from adequate potassium intake, without a doubt. Like that stuff's all important. But if you don't get the sodium right, then it's almost impossible to fix everything else. Like it's more dangerous to be under sodiumed than over sodiumed in relative amounts. Yeah. Yeah.
So is there like a proportion of sodium to water? Like, that I don't know if I'm asking the question right, but you get my point. Like you're taking so much sodium versus I should drink like a gallon of water a day, or if I'm taking this much sodium and I should only drink half a gallon.
Yeah. So this is isotonic versus hypertonic versus hypotonic solution. So isotonic is the amount of dissolved stuff that we would have in our body. And it's very easy for like an isotonic solution. It doesn't disturb the body when you consume it. Like a hypertonic solution, like a very concentrated salt or sugar solution, will cause gut distress because the body is actually trying to pull water out of the body to dilute what is in the gut. The flip side is that a hypotonic solution, if it's too hypotonic, then we're overwhelming the body with water and not putting in enough electrolytes or glucose or whatever the thing is. And the approximate ratio for an isotonic solution of sodium is for every 1 liter of liquid, you have about 9 grams of sodium, which is a lot. 9 grams of sodium chloride, which is about half of that. So it would be like taking about an element and a half, maybe a little bit more than that, per every liter of water. But you don't have to do it exactly perfect with that. Again, so long as we provide adequate sodium, the kidneys will ramp things up and they can excrete some water absent sodium and retain that sodium to make things work. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And then I think even myself too, and people that aren't knowledgeable, I think they, you always hear, even in like, bro science, it's like, you don't want to have, you get too much salt, you're going to puff up, you're going to be, but is that still somebody with not enough sodium? Like, in other words, or just not enough water in relation to their sodium intake? Like,
That's a really good question. And most folks will probably be able to kind of relate with this. Like, think about a time where you went hiking and the only thing you took with you was water. And usually by the end of the day, your hands are swelling and like your feet are swelling. And it's because we're actually deficient in sodium and potassium is too high. And we start getting all kinds of different swelling, like of our hands, cerebral edema, which is brain swelling. So interestingly, the inadequate sodium is generally more of a problem from that, like, swollen hands, swollen feet. When people are in, really dire straits with kidney function and they're on dialysis, sodium is important, but they really look super closely at potassium, because potassium imbalances are the things that will kill you. And excess potassium is the thing that will really kill people. Cardiac function, like the lethal injection is a big bolus of potassiame. It causes the heart to cramp and then it's done.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And so it's interesting, like, and most people eat too much processed foods and they don't get enough potassium. They get arguably maybe too much sodium relative to potassium in that context of overly processed foods. But the thing that could kill you, like in a matter of hours or minutes, is way too much potassium absent adequate sodium. So it's like everything is so broken in our nutrition world that it's hard to really get like a good like North Star. It's like, okay, where the hell do I go? Like what is the orienting feature here? Because on the one hand, our diets generally are train wrecks and it's full of hyperpalatable, highly processed foods. We don't get enough potassium. We don't get enough magnesium from that. But then the flip side is that when people start cleaning up their diet, they tend to get totally inadequate sodium, which may overall be even more dangerous than the inadequate potassium. And
they think they're doing the right thing, which, I just can't believe that, how, like, even just me, it's like, oh, okay, when you're cleaning up your diet, you want to, like, say, shred up or whatever. Okay, lay off the salt and then get a lot of water and clean food. And meanwhile, you feel like sometimes I almost felt like I was popping up even more.
Yeah, and you probably were. And there's a really interesting smart dude, Stan Efferding. He's kind of like a power bodybuilder guy, big, huge dude. And he's been talking about salt loading and bodybuilding and powerlifting and performance for a long time. And he was really fringe when he first started out on this, but like he's like so many things, he's moving to the center of the bullseye, moving to the mainstream in because I think his physiology for this stuff is just spot on, you know, and he's not a low carb athlete by any means, but even then he still makes the case that for different performance aesthetics and you know, just how you're feeling in the gym and just in life in general, that it's really improved with adequate sodium. And he's recommending, you know, 10 plus grams of sodium per day for larger strength athletes. Yeah. He's really aggressive on it.
Yeah, I don't know, it makes sense. If you're burning a lot of calories, you're going to need it. You know?
That's the thing. You know, we're talking highly active individuals, and specifically on this podcast for the, you know, your average jiu-jitsu practitioner who's rolling hard 2 to 3 times a week or more. You know, if they haven't tried LMNT yet or gotten their hands on your product to add that to a bottle of water, what outside of that would you recommend a general athlete that's, you know, or a general practitioner, I should say, not even a competitor, how would you recommend that somebody that generally, again, is eating somewhat okay, they're not off the wall with their processed foods, even just add, like, what would you recommend just adding salt to their water?
So, you know, a couple of ways you could tackle this. And I think a smart way to do it, it's a little bit of work, but use a free app like Chronometer, which documents all of your food, all of your electrolytes, and input everything into that. And it will tell you your protein, carbs, fat, but it will tell you your sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. Then we have a legit baseline and we're not guessing. This is where I screwed this up forever. Like in 2005 or 3, whenever I talked to Greg Glassman, had I just sat down and like weighed and measured my food and paid attention to what I was eating, I could have cut 20 years off of like flailing around and suffering, you know? And so for 2 or 3 days worth of effort, we'll get a legit baseline of where folks are. And what I would recommend is that folks make sure that they're getting at least 5 grams of sodium per day as a minimum. And some people may need double than that. And very occasionally people will need even a little bit more than that, depending on the size, heat, humidity, all that type of stuff. Like we try to do most years, go do Henry Aiken's Jiu-Jitsu camp down in Costa Rica. And it's an awesome setup. It's this open air facility, but it's you get a breeze through there, but the breeze is 94 degrees. The humidity is 98%. Right. And we're wearing gis for the whole time, you know, and it's like 3 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. And I'll end up doing 15 grams of sodium on those days total. You know, like I'll do 3 or 4 elements during the 3 hours in the morning and 2 or 3 of them later. And then I'm kind of filling in between as well. And if I don't do that, and we saw it, people are cramping, they get brain fog and lethargy and fatigue. And when they get on point with the electrolytes, like it's just magic. It's like a light switch is flipped. So I would really recommend that folks weigh and measure their food and their electrolyte intake and make sure they're getting between at least 5 grams of sodium, and then play with whether or not they need more. And
Yeah, I say you brought up an interesting point. Like a lot of people are not tracking it, right? They're not tracking how much energy they're burning. They're not tracking how much fuel they're putting into their bodies, how much, you know, whatever, you know, how much salt. They're not tracking it. And if you track it, you're able to adjust it and see how you felt that day, you know, versus the next day.
Yeah, for sure.
Even with the tracking, there's people that do really adamant about this, and they track and they can see how much sodium they're taking in, but then they don't realize how much they're depleting. And, you know,
and that's where I like the tracking to establish a baseline. And then what I really encourage people to do is just feel what it's like when you're on point. So like, so if folks go to drinkelement.com/homebrew, we have all these recipe guides for how to make this stuff at home. Like you take your own sodium, potassium chloride from no salt, some magnesium citrate, mix it all up, you know, lemon juice, stevia. But when people, this was the crazy thing for me, is that my coaches told me, go drink some pickle juice before your next jiu-jitsu class. And I was like, okay. And I did it. And I was like, oh my God, because it was just like, I had this low gear. I didn't fatigue the way I normally did. Like normally I try to play a relaxed game anyway, because I'm going to be 50 in a couple of days. I want to do this for a long time. I want as minimally attribute based game as I can. But there's sometimes when you got to hustle. There's sometimes when you got to scramble, or you end up in even worse shit than, had you just not like saved yourself a little bit. And I would, because of eating this low carb diet without adequate sodium, I would just get mauled because I was so worried about gassing. Mm-hmm. And then when I drank this pickle juice, I was like, oh my God, there's this whole like other gear that exists.
I gotta back you up on that one, because I've done that. I've taken like the organic, really good like pickles, and then literally the juice, and even just after post training, how good that is, and it's because your body is just so lacking.
It is ready for it. Yeah, it is so ready for it.
But I can speak to LMNT because after teaching classes, and then you do the kids classes, and then a night class and adults, you're just like wiped. There's a specific feeling, and you mentioned it, is that low gear. It's like that feeling that you want to do something physical, and it's because you have enough of that, that sodium in there to be able to feel that. There's that feeling like, oh man, shit, I don't feel like working out, versus, man, I can keep going. And that, to me, and my experience with not being knowledgeable with electrolytes and things like that, and then having LMNT, is like, man, you feel like you just have that low gear. It's the best way to describe it.
Yeah. And so what I really encourage folks to do is just experience that state of not feeling like shit, and then try to get back there, and it's funny because I'm a co-founder of this company. I have LMNT boxes all over the place, and I can't tell you how often, like, my wife will look at me and she's like, did you have some LMNT today? And I'm like, no. And like, I'm dragging ass. I'm not feeling good. Like, my energy level isn't what it could be. And you just kind of forget to do it. Also, now that I live in Montana, when it's cold, I just don't have a desire to drink as much stuff. So like, we have a chocolate salt, and I put that in some coffee. And so I will sip on that a little bit, but it's interesting that if we can get people to get in their body and just feel what feeling good is like, then they can get back to that thing. And so the most difficult question for me to answer is like, how much electrolytes do you need? I don't know, from person to person and moment to moment. Like, I know that for most people, they need to be at a minimum of 5 grams per day. But then from there, it's kind of like, are you a 6'4" male or a 5'2" female? Are you a super sweater? Like, there are some people that just sweat more in volume, and they also have like 2 to 3 times more sodium in their sweat than other people do. Like, we've done some work with some NHL teams that track this, and like, some of these bigger hockey players will lose 10 pounds of sweat in the course of a game or a practice, and 10 grams of sodium.
Wow.
It's just huge. But then you have another guy that looks just like these other dudes, and he's losing half of that, in the course of a game. So it becomes really individual. I've wanted some way to, tell people, okay, you're in this category and you're in that category. But the best that I've been able to come up with is just encouraging people to experience what adequate electrolytes feel like, once. It's like, you feel good, you're performing good, and then just try to get back to that. And when you start feeling a little bit off, that's when you need some pickle juice, or like some olives or salami or LMNT or something like that. Yeah.
I think it's funny too how, like, animals know they naturally need salt and they go to salt licks, but humans are like, no, don't take in any sodium. Like, it's like, why would we not follow something that's natural, for all living things on the planet,
Well, and it's the only nutrient that we have a dedicated sense of taste for. So, like, if you chewed up a B vitamin, it would taste like chemicals, but there isn't a dedicated sense of taste for that. Whereas, like, we have sweet, salty, sour, umami. So the salt flavor is a really, really critical feature. Sodium is it's a vital nutrient. People will die with inadequate levels of it. Yeah.
And isn't it also one of the first, I don't want to say spices, but one of the first things that humans were harvesting, right?
Yeah.
You're not worth your salt, right? It's like, you're not worth your salt.
Yeah. But that was one of the first things human beings were going, okay, we got to collect this and we got to put it on our food. And, and we just more recently have gotten away from, okay, we need sodium. But think about people 3,000 years ago would probably burn a lot more energy than most people do today.
Right. Yeah. The term salary comes from the Roman Empire days when they paid soldiers in salt. And so sol is Latin deal and salary and all that. Yeah. Yeah. Huh. So that's kind of a fun thing with this company too, is there's all this kind of fascinating history around salt and cultural uses of salt and all that stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, that's I love all that stuff. You realize the history and how important, salt was, in throughout history. Kind of we've gotten away from that, especially for athletes. So this is exactly why we wanted to have you on. This is all really important stuff for any athletes, but specifically, for jiu-jitsu. There's not enough of that information going around. So if this could help with any of that, it's great. I actually want to shift topics a little bit, and one of my things is having been in the whole, really heavy in the CrossFit industry back in the day, purely the, how do you see that, like, as far as the community aspect comparing to jiu-jitsu? Because to me, it's very similar, you go to a CrossFit box or in general, functional fitness, you kind of warm up and then you have the technique portion, whether PVC pipe and you're working your Olympic lifts and you're doing your strength stuff. There's a lot of technique oriented around that. And then the WOD, and that's like rolling, So when I did, CrossFit, it was very similar to how a jiu-jitsu class was run. And then like the whole community aspect of it is very similar. I think people can see that. However, I think the business model of CrossFit, how the boxes work, how it's affiliations and not like a cookie cutter franchise, how the CrossFit games work or did work, still yet to come in jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, that's a really good question. And
see how jiu-jitsu is so split,
Yeah, jiu-jitsu split in that there isn't that one governing body of like CrossFit, although that is happening in this scene. So you have like the Florida Grid League, which is kind of their interpretation of kind of CrossFit, and they've got some little bit less randomization, but some really interesting stuff they're doing. You have like the Rogue Games and the Granite Games, which it's CrossFit movements, but it's not under the CrossFit banner. But people aren't as provincial about people going from one group to another, one gym to another. That is definitely one thing that's challenging within jiu-jitsu, because there's this whole like lineage. And if you want to train,
you're a trader.
And that's definitely challenging. But I think that there is something interesting about jiu-jitsu, that there tends to be a longer term investment, in my opinion, generally. Because with CrossFit, you could reach a point, and people do this. They do reach a point with jiu-jitsu where it's 2 or 3 people, 4 people. They get some mats and they just train in their garage, and that's it. And that's what they do. But it seems to work much better for CrossFit type stuff than it does for jiu-jitsu, because at some point, if you only have 4 people to train with, each other's games so well that it's kind of like, what's the point in even doing it? Like, you have to do silly stuff like, I'm going to put, I'm going to hold tennis balls so that I don't have grips, so that it changes the game, because it just becomes this total Groundhog Day deal. And I really think that a lot of jiu-jitsu schools, and similar to what CrossFit needs to do, is really run better businesses, like charge more, have bathrooms that are clean enough that you could eat off the floors, and then people are inspired to like be there and spend money there and stuff like that. Like the SBGs here in Montana, they offer lifetime memberships, and I'm not sure what the price is, but it's 5-figure upfront costs to buy yourself a lifetime membership at these things, and people do it a lot, but they also offer like huge value. Like it's a really well-run scene. There are hard people there. There are tough people, but I haven't encountered people that are just like dicks and that are dangerous because they get shuffled out of the program.
There's a lot of SBGs overseas, right?
There are, yeah. There's a good number of them overseas. So I really think that on both sides. The funny thing is that Jiu-Jitsu and CrossFit could take a huge page out of like the strip mall karate or taekwondo playbook out of business. Like there's some systemization that one could do, and like really having a nice experience going in and signing up, and continuity, and like the kids programs where the kids they advance within the kids belt curriculum, but they have these like life skills things that the kids do each month, and this is within the SPG program, but apparently a lot of Taekwondo schools do this too. So they're getting stripes on both sides of their belt, one for life skills, one for Jiu-Jitsu skills. And oh my God, it's good. Like when I first heard about it, I'm like, this is the cheesiest shit that I've ever seen. And then my daughters found out about it and they're like, I can get stripes for being a good student. And they're like, aye, Captain, like I'm going to do this. I'm like, oh my God, like this really works. And the kids are really motivated, and it makes them come back. And then it to some degree, it makes the lives of the parents easier because their kids are more
doing their homework.
Yeah. So I do think that both sides of this story would really benefit from like run a super, super good business and charge what you're worth and deliver, over deliver off of what you're charging. But, for me, the community out of Jiu-Jitsu is it like I said, I think at the beginning of the show, it's the reason why we moved to this area was because of these connections that we had with these people in particular. And I think that if folks can think about that, running a brick and mortar, Jiu-Jitsu program, like it'll pay off for them in the long run. And just back to your question, I do think that there's a lot of parallels there. And the interesting thing is that in a CrossFit gym, people are more likely to talk about sleep and food and body composition and all these other things that I think are really important. And I am dumbfounded why martial arts schools don't champion that stuff more, and if you're not an expert, find somebody who can just talk about this stuff, or find somebody online that you like their material, and maybe you've got one vegan guy you like, one paleo guy you like, and feed that in a newsletter to your patrons. But like, people join martial arts schools and jiu-jitsu frequently, one of the main things that they want to do is get in shape and lose weight, and then it's like, never talk about diet, never talk about sleep.
There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people that literally walk in the door. They have no interest in self-defense, but they are interested in learning martial arts, for all the benefits, fitness, losing weight, and learning an art at the same time that, as a secondary effect, they can defend themselves, but their main goal wasn't to come in for self-defense. And I think that's a good point. I mean, in the CrossFit box, it's such a laid-back environment, and I would argue that people don't freely discuss in jiu-jitsu classes and martial arts in general, because it's a little bit more of a stricter environment, especially a lot of old school academies where you can't really talk during the techniques and stuff. You can talk after the class, but I think in CrossFit, it's people are chatting during the workout, and they're just freely. I think it's more of a freely open environment for discussion. I think that definitely plays a role with it. I also think you made a good point where you're right. You can't just for the sake of making the bottom dollar and a profit, have a place that looks like crap, and you do everything bottom dollar just to get something up and running to maximize your profit. Like, you can't charge a huge monthly tuition or even a year contract, let's say, if your place doesn't look like you're using, doesn't look like it deserves that. Like, so I think that's a good point you made. You gotta have a presentation,
Well, yeah, and I think back in the day, it was okay to be like a dirty jiu-jitsu gym that smelled horrible, because there was how many of them, right? Now there's a lot more.
Yeah. It's a good point. Like, in the beginning, people would drive hours to get in their jiu-jitsu training. Now people are like, well, this gym is 15 minutes away and has the kids class and a sauna. And, they start doing the same calculus that they do around like Globo gyms. And
I think like CrossFit, the automatic, when I got, and I just draw so many parallels because I've been so deep with both things that I'm like, in CrossFit, when you started, it was already the general consensus that you can drop into any CrossFit. It would be generally the same, and it's welcomed, and everybody can cross train, if you will. That to me was clear when I first started. Like, this is the part of the community is training with everybody. Right. So I think that is a huge parallel, but at a big difference at the same time. That I was like, wow, jiu-jitsu needs more of that. more of like a feel that it's going to be generally the same. There's no secrets anymore. There's no seeking out, the Brazilian master in the mountains of Brazil kind of thing.
Right.
And now it's all over YouTube. The secret is the community you build on those mats,
Yeah. And I think leaning into that community, and then just be, the real power I think that CrossFit offers is that. So in my second book, Wired to Eat, I break things down, for what we need is food, movement, sleep, and community. And within a CrossFit box, like they'll talk about food. The movement is CrossFit and mobility and all that stuff. So that just happens. The community is, part of the big reason why you're there. And a smart coach will talk to you about your sleep and circadian rhythm because it's so important for your body composition and all that stuff. And I really think that jiu-jitsu coaches would do well to take a little bit, a page out of that like strength coach binder. How are you guys sleeping? How are you recovering? What's your food? What are your overall goals? Like, and you can spin off peripheral programs, like set up a dedicated nutrition program, 30-day resets. Like there's a lot of interesting opportunities there, but so much of the stickiness of CrossFit was because you got all of that stuff in one spot. Like it was like a one-stop shop. Right. If you had a chiropractor there so you could get adjusted and like you got it all.
That's how it was at the CrossFit I worked out at.
Yeah.
I mean, you're probably getting more nutritional advice and sleep advice from your, junior high wrestling coach than, you do at a jiu-jitsu school. Realistically, it's usually like, how's your weight cut going at a jiu-jitsu school? And that's about it.
Yeah. And I think that that's a big failure. Like, I think people should step up their games, and I think that it would provide a much better offering. And if you aren't the expert, you can outsource that stuff. You can get newsletters from other people, or
that's why CrossFit helped me huge in that aspect. I remember coming up and getting ready for tournaments. The only advice I got to lose weight was eat less, train more.
Right.
And that was it. You just beat yourself up and just train and kill on the mat to get ready for competition. Then you feel like you can't even fight. I wish I had some element back in the day.
Right. Right.
I know.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's one thing that I think is a big, Brian knows it's a big part of my, my whole discovery of both journeys lately. And Jiu-Jitsu Motivation does have something coming out to kind of be with all the things we just talked about. And we'll tell you offline. We're going to be getting ready to release it this year, though. But I think it kind of ties in exactly what we're talking about. We want to throw it by you off air, Rob, see what you think.
Okay. I'm excited because there's a desperate need there. Like the Congressional Budget Office, there are these people, bean counters in the United States government. They have an estimate that by 2035, the United States will be bankrupt from diabetes-related costs. Like we'll spend more money dealing with diabetes than we have. And I suspect COVID probably accelerated that. Yeah. But in the back of my head, I've always seen gyms like CrossFit or Jiu-Jitsu gyms as that is, in my mind, primary care medicine. You go get exercise, you get community, you ideally you get some discussion about like good nutrition, and that is where you get healthy. The doc in the box and your primary care physician is secondary care medicine in my mind. That's when you're sick. That's when something's broken. Like your coach is your primary care healthcare provider in my mind, So I just feel like there's this huge opportunity for coaches to do more. I think it would make for a more engaging and interesting environment, because you're able to help people with more stuff. I think that there's opportunities to monetize different things, to keep people in the gym longer term, to make their lifetime customer value more valuable, like just all kinds of win-win everywhere. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just give a shout out where everybody can, keep in touch with you. You got your personal page, you got LMNT. What are those handles on social media?
LMNT website is drinkelement, LMNT.com. And I do a ton of writing for that. And then it's just robbwolf.com. And you can find my links to social. And I do a pretty good podcast with my wife. It's called The Healthy Rebellion Radio.
Awesome. Well, I'd love
Thank you,
to
Rob.
and check all those out. I encourage everybody to check all of that out. I think we can use a lot more of that in jiu-jitsu. And yeah, but we're going to be, I'd love to have you back on, periodically, just get some updates and keep in touch with what jiu-jitsu people can really do to improve their recovery and training in general. I think this is a huge piece that was missing in my journey. I wish I had done it a lot sooner. I'm glad that I discovered, CrossFit in you, 10 years ago and started implementing it. I just wish I'd done it a lot sooner. I think everybody can benefit from that. So once again, I really appreciate you coming on, man.
Huge honor. Anytime you want me to bring down property values, I will do it. So thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll jump offline. We'll chat. I know Brian's got to go, but I want to just chat with you for a few minutes too.
Great.
All right, boys. I'm going to jump off. Rob, it was a pleasure meeting you.
Great to meet you.